Welcome to our session this afternoon on cover crops, successes and failures. So my name is Joe Stanley, and for the next 25 minutes, I'll be chairing this session. I'm head of sustainable farming at the GWCT's Allerton project, which is a research and demonstration farm in Leicestershire. And this tent is much larger than I was anticipating. When we agreed to do this session, I would have done a lot more preparation if I'd have known there'd have been about 300 people watching us. However, we still have speakers up to the size of the tent, personalities to deal with this many in the tent. So to my left here, to your right, we have, first of all, Tom Dewars, who is a Suffolk arable farmer. Now, Tom has what he describes as an ambitious agri-environment scheme across his farm, which presumably this year means...
You described it.
It means that it's growing, which I think is an ambition we can probably all try to aspire to this year. Tom is very experienced in the use of cover crops, but also in doing strange things like spraying Coca-Cola on his crops to see the impact of that. Toby will need a little introduction. He is royalty. He's groundswell royalty. And in 2022 is a Nuffield scholar who his title for his scholarship was Catch and Cover Cropping Opportunities in UK Arable Agriculture. So obviously incredibly pertinent, not only to the changing agricultural landscape, but also to this topic here today. And finally, we have Jim Egan from King's Crops. Now, Jim works closely with the Allerton project, and actually in the past was also an agri-environment scheme advisor. Jim has seen it all when it comes to farms and farmers trying to get to grips with cover crops, both from a very basic level and from a very advanced level. So we'll also bring that technical side of experience to our discussions today. So we'll be looking for some fantastic contributions from the floor. We've only got 25 minutes, but I will leap in from the start and put it to the three of you. Jim, you travel all over the country. Toby, you've been all over the world. And Tom, you come from Suffolk. What would you say, what are some of the key themes that you've really picked up on? Successes and failures. What do people get wrong when they first get into this job? And, what are some of the key takeaways that people might take from this session?
Well, personally, plenty of failures on our part, but every failure we learn something a little bit, and then hopefully that leads to a bit of success down the road. But what really has struck me is the importance of treating cover cropping as highly as you would any other sort of crop on the farm, giving it the due diligence and time, spending the sort of right amount of money that you need to achieve those results. And where I sort of saw farmers really kind of maximising this was where they've been working at it for a long time, giving it a real good go, a good chance. And the failures that we've sort of found is where we've tried to cut corners, perhaps sort of kind of neglected some of the care and the ongoing management that's needed with cover crops for them to achieve the objectives that we want them to. And so, off the back of that, the more time we put into them, when it comes to establishment, getting the right seed mix, getting the right sort of objectives that are clear for us, we find that we can measure success a lot more when we do that.
I'd wholeheartedly agree with that. I mean, when we first started, we were just cover cropping sort of straight mustard in front of the plough before sugar beet, just to try and make the plough turn up easier. But as we've gone on and we've learned that we've got to invest in them, and the more species that we put in, the more chance of success we've got, because every year everything seems to be different, so we've got more chance of something succeeding. But also, certainly over the last couple of years, I've learned that we have got to spend more money on perhaps slug pellets and things like that to ensure they're successful, because when we do get them right, we can really see the benefit. And it's always been a bit of a struggle because you see the money going out, but it's very, very hard to quantify the money coming back in again. So I think really we need to make sure that we invest in them, because we're convinced that they are the right thing to do. We need to invest and make sure that they are there. Otherwise, we don't see the benefit at all.
And it's easy to neglect them and not treat them as the important part of the rotation, essentially, that they are. Absolutely. Jim?
Agreeing with these two, you do see lots of failures, and it's really important to learn from them. The most important thing for me is planning and actually understanding what you want that cover crop to do. As an advisor, I talk to lots and lots of different people. Toby's already mentioned it. Tom has in a way. What are your objectives for the cover crop? And make sure you build it from there. Everyone will have a different objective. You usually outline 5 things, end up with the farmer at the end of the conversation saying, I want all 5. You're not an easy bunch to please, but you need to really understand what your core key objective is with that cover crop. Then you can get the right cover crop mix. Then you can start to get some real successes. So if you're looking for nutrient capture, you probably need a radish in it. That's a conversation to start to have then which one and why. And then you can have some real successes. You can actually prevent leaching of up to 70 kilos of nitrogen that you're keeping on your farm. For me, big tick success. The failure comes with that, and Toby said it, the failure comes when you don't treat it as a crop. It's the last thing that gets done. It doesn't get drilled till late. And by late, my late is after the 15th of September. And that's got nothing to do with anything other than daylight hours shortening. So the plant hasn't got time to get established and get growing. So we'll see failures with people not planning. We'll see failures, people with not treating it like a crop. And then the biggest failure you see half the time is the weather. And there's nothing any of us can do about that. But the critical bit to get success is to have a proper plan and to understand what you want that cover crop to do.
And I know, personally, I'd very much failed at that point. When I was farming at home on my family farm, I just started to get interested in cover crops before I went to the Allerton project. And I wanted to put a cover crop to replace a failed crop of winter rape. So I just went to the agronomist, give me something to chuck on there as a bit of an experiment. I just want the cheapest thing you've got. I just want to, I want to grow a cover crop and I want it to be cheap. And it was not a successful experiment. It was not a good cover crop. But I just had a very, personally limited understanding. Now, I'm sure the vast majority of people in this room have a very good understanding of what works on their farms. But yeah, it is really important to appreciate that not all farmers actually have this innate understanding of how to make cover crops work on their farms. Now, I'm going to ask one more question to our panel, then I'll be coming to the room. So if people could put hands in the air, and I'll be able to direct the mic to you as we go through. Now, guys, since 2018, let's be honest, for me at least, it seems like the weather has dropped off a cliff. The weather is becoming increasingly extreme. For me, there's no doubt that climate change is beginning to significantly impact on agricultural operations here in the UK. When it comes to cover crops, we start with Tom. Tom, sorry, that's your name. We'll start with Tom. We're good friends. How do you feel that cover cropping, decisions you're making around cover cropping are changing with the climate? Are they becoming more difficult to manage? And also, how are you seeing them within a rotation as the climate starts to change?
So the answer to that obviously is both, really. Yes to both. So they are becoming more difficult because of the weather patterns, and we've had these. We're in Suffolk. It's generally quite dry until last year, but generally we just don't see any rain for most of the spring, and we don't see a lot of rain after harvest either. So getting them to actually grow is very challenging. But equally, if they're not there, especially if in a direct drilling situation like we're doing, we can't get a crop in, because it's then when it does rain, it doesn't stop and it's too wet. So actually, I mean, when we talk about cover cropping, we've seen actually far more successes with shorter term sort of catch cropping. Getting them in straight after harvest. And if we've got some green cover there, the roots generally give us a nice tilth to drill straight into. The green cover allows the drill to travel when it's a little wetter on top. Conversely, in the spring, if that cover is still there, for us, you've got no hope. You cannot drill straight into it and expect to get a cereal crop to grow. We have to have basically turned it off pre-Christmas, basically, in order to get the soil to warm up again. And it is a challenge, because then in the spring it's too wet, and then bang, it doesn't rain for 3 months, so it's then too dry. So it is a massive challenge, but I think the benefits of having them are going to offset those challenges. So we need to just work very hard at making them work. And I think generally Toby might be able to answer this better, but the actual once the seed is in the ground, it does seem to grow eventually. Perhaps.
Well, Toby, you've seen cover crops being grown in what would for us be very extreme conditions around the world. So, yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's not just climatic changes, which are very apparent, especially during the time we want to establish them, during harvest. There's labour availability, there's lack of moisture if it's too dry, there's the potential chemistry still in the soils from residual herbicides. They all provide different challenges, and there's no right sort of way about it. But fundamentally, if we can get seeds in the ground, seed-to-soil contact, something growing, even if it's not going to be for very long and it's not necessarily going to achieve, a sort of picture-perfect biomass that's going to look amazing. Actually, it's those living roots that are so fundamental. They're almost sort of system enablers. And yes, it's challenging to get them growing. We've got to try. It's our job as farmers to plant things. But at the same time, it will build us resilience into the system. And it enables no-till. It enables livestock integration. It provides sort of structure to the soil. So when it is very wet, it provides drainage. But equally, when it's very dry, the residues protect the soil, keep it cool, and keep the biology active. So just fundamentally, every opportunity to get living roots in the soil, they may not work every time. It may be, as we've had, probably just as many failures in terms of establishment during the summer as we have successes. But if we don't try, we won't ever succeed.
And Jim, you'll know from the Allerton project, we've been doing this thing for many years with you, and it has been an incredibly challenging season. We have not had those living roots in the soil like we would like. But in terms of how weather patterns are changing, what would your advice be to people?
I think really back up what Toby's just said. It's about having living roots in the soil year round. Don't just associate cover crops with winter cover cropping. Tom's made the point they might not always work depending on what your soil type is, what your cropping rotation is. So be prepared to fill all those gaps. This year's an absolute classic. It's happened to nearly everybody. There are great tranches of land, particularly in the East Midlands where I live and work, that aren't drilled. Well, if you leave it, you're actually going to be in worse condition than when you come to drill again in this coming autumn. So actually putting something in the ground to cover this summer is a worthwhile exercise. It's actually going to help aerate the soil. It's actually going to make your conditions better for establishing and drilling into next time. It may well fix you some nutrient. It'll make sure you've captured all the nutrient that's left there. So this year, it's a really good example of being flexible and wanting to do something. Building on what Tom said about that gap in between cropping, 9 times out of 10, let's say you get your winter barley off, 10th of July. You're not putting your next crop in until the second week in September at the earliest. It's the best growing season in solar panels you've ever seen in your life. Put something in the ground to actually convert that sunlight into energy and go into the soil to build your carbon up, to actually start to improve your soil health. Don't leave it bare. Because the other thing that happens through that time more and more, and I know from my holidays in Cornwall in August when you lot are busy and don't necessarily want to talk to us, last August we had 3 named storms, one after the other. If the ground's bare then and you've been in early with your combine, that's when you're going to lose the soil. That's when the nutrients are going to disappear. There's more and more interest from people like Tom and Toby in what do I do in that short gap? And in that gap, growing things like berseem, clover, buckwheat, fast-growing annuals that will disappear, that you don't need a chemical to take out, is a really, really proactive thing to do. So for me, it's about thinking about it year-round. It's about plugging every gap you can, and it's about working in everybody's rotation. It works in veg rotation, cereals rotations, and making it work hard for you.
And I know, again, from my experience, you'll have potentially cultivated or at least fallow ground from, late autumn, potentially all the way through to late spring, and you've just got nothing happening on that land. And, when you come from a tenanted situation, especially as I did, it kind of, when you actually think about it, finally, in the context of the sorts of things that we learn about here at Groundswell, it's insane that you've got nothing happening in that field for, maybe 6 months of the year. And then, as Jim said, a summer fallow period on top of that. And hopefully we can come back to talking about some of the summer fallow options as well. And again, how that fits into a changing climate potentially after this. But I've got a question near the front here. Again, if we can see any hands for questions through the tent, that would be fantastic. But please, Tom.
Hi there, Tom Martin. You occasionally hear about cover crops having detrimental effects on the following crop. Are there any common watch-outs or kind of things to be aware of that you could share with us?
Yeah, we've seen them all on our own farm as well. Carbon nitrogen lockup. So if there's a lot of sort of heavy carbon residues going into the soil and we're putting in a small seed afterwards, we can get nutrient lockup. That can be a problem. There's the allelopathic effect of residues and plants sort of breaking down again, sort of causing us a headache. There's slug issues potentially, but we do find where we leave and plant on the green, certainly in the autumn, the slug pressure is negated by the fact that they're going to eat their favourite diet, which is the cover crop, not the sort of crop that you've planted. And then again, sort of thinking about the termination, it's probably the most important timing to get right in terms of causing yourself a headache. Depending on your soil type, if you're on heavy soils, you terminate too late. You get a cold, wet spring like we've had. It can be really hard to dry up and get things growing. So it's all about thinking about what you want that cover crop to achieve. Getting the termination timing right in balance is key.
Yeah, very specifically, we've had some nightmares putting things like oats or rye in front of a spring cereal. That we won't do again.
Jim, I know this is actually one of your specialist subjects.
I wouldn't call it a specialist subject, a bit like being on Mastermind. But Toby and Tom have said it. You need to plan. You need to think about what your next crop is in the rotation. You need to treat your cover crop like a crop. So actually think through what goes in the mix. Don't do what Joe did, and I know why you did it, but don't just go, I'm going to put a cover crop in because. Think through what the impacts are and vary the cover crop. Every person you get your seed from will happily help you vary it. There's probably 25 different variants just straight away off the shelf from most people. So think it through, work out what your target is. Where does the radish fit in your rotation? Where does the cereal fit? Is it going to impact? And you need to treat it like a crop. If you do that, you won't have those issues. If you just treat it and just do it for the cover crop in itself, you're eventually going to get tied into a bit of a knot somewhere down the line.
Depressingly, I'm nearly 40 and my specialist subject would still be the original Star Wars trilogy. Following on from many, many hours of religiously practicing when I was a teenager. Please, one question here and then a chap on the row behind you.
Have you had any experience with crimp rolling in the spring and then drilling straight into a cereal or whatever?
I think crimp rolling's very widely used, certainly in drier climates or colder places where it can be quite effective. For it to work really, really well, the plant needs to be fairly mature so that it can crimp and kill the stem. We haven't used a crimp roller necessarily ourselves because in the spring it's probably going to be too wet. We've tried ring rolling Cambridge rolls on a frost, yet to kind of see too much difference between where we've done that or actually just sprayed it out at a similar time. And that's perhaps a good way of sort of reducing the biomass. But when it comes to killing, for us, grass weeds, which would be our main reason why we'd have a sort of overwinter cover crop and a break, it wouldn't, for us, potentially work given our soil type, given our climate.
Yeah, likewise, we've tried one on the frost. I've since been told it was the wrong type of cover crop roller because it didn't have a sharp enough edge and it didn't really do the job. But I'd echo that really. If you've got a big tall cover crop, then it might work. But when we're trying to kill grass weeds, you're not going to completely get away from glyphosate because those grass weeds will still be in the bottom untouched.
And even when you've done that crimper rolling or you've rolled on the frost, you may well still need to go back and do something else. It's a case of actually looking and understanding what's there. Take the opportunity. The frosts the other year were fantastic. They will have reduced people's use of glyphosate. They will have knocked the cover crops back, but don't think that's the only answer. Be prepared to go and use your eyes and look and see what's there.
I have the pleasure of working with a number of utilities companies, and they're not generally known for being brilliant at reinstating agricultural land when they've finished. Is there a role for cover crops in helping to re-establish that soil structure and speed up the return to productive agriculture following completion?
I think there is. I wouldn't necessarily term it a cover crop straight away. I think that's where it's that broad stretch of what are you going to grow, what's your outcome, what do you want? But that's the type of thing where you could be growing legumes, you could be growing stuff for a couple of years to actually build that soil fertility back up. That's the type of place where thinking about really good herbal lays can actually start to build your soil fertility back, build your structure back and putting the right things in. They might be in a big enough expanse that you can actually bring some livestock in. So it's about the aim of what you want. In my book, that's not a straight cover crop, but it is in what we're talking about today. It's green cover to help reinvigorate what you're doing. So yes, they do. And yes, you'll find a lot of other people will pay you for doing that these days because there's lots of other people with lots of other agendas that might fit.
I think it goes without saying that you should. I think any sort of soil reparation. I mean, I'm sure we've all done it. You go, oh, there's a problem there. We'll go and subsoil it, and then the next time you run over in a wet, you sink up to the depth that you subsoiled it. And the lady in the big top just now, I can't remember her name, the French lady, but she mentioned it. Put the cover crop on first, and then do the cultivation, so you don't have to go back in again until you've got those roots have sort of helped structure the soil that you've effectively restructured or lost the structure on. And I think that goes not just for utility reparations, but any soil reparations really.
Question over here.
Yes. You said what radish and why. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Yep, so it's thinking about the variety and what you want that radish to do. So, for example, if you're going to be drilling late because you're behind a late harvested crop, you want an early flowering radish because you want that radish to have as much energy as you possibly can to grow in the shortest possible time. Conversely, if you're drilling early, and my early's from mid-July mid-August back out to July, you actually want a later flowering radish. So it's about thinking about the variety of the plant that you're using, how long is it going to grow, and what's the impact at the end. What you don't want is you don't want that radish to go woody, so pick the right variety so it doesn't grow to that point. Comes back to the point that Toby was making. That's when it starts to lock up lots of nutrient, it starts to get stemmy, and you get the wrong carbon-nitrogen ratio. So it's really important that when you do start to talk about it, if you are talking that specific, ask the people that you're getting it from, what variety, what's its flowering date, even to the extent that this year we've had discussions about bulb size. And actually, on the continent, in Denmark and Germany, they have a recommended list for radish. And it will tell you how big the bulb's going to be, how wide it's going to grow, and that can give you an indication of the circumstance you want to use it in. So there is a lot to think about, and there are a lot of people out there who can talk you through that process to make it work for you.
Also worth thinking about what's in the rotation, certainly if you've got root crops, because there can be nematode build-up specific to the radish that you're planting, but equally there can be nematode reduction depending on the variety. And actually, if you know what nematodes you've got, you can target those. You can use a cover crop quite effectively to reduce your nematodes or build up the problem without realising it.
Yeah, and that comes back at what Toby said. Make sure you have the discussion and pick the right variety. That's actually really, really important.
And having better data about what's actually going on in our soils, which is something I think a lot of people do fall down on. Now I'm going to try and squeeze two in before we have to finish. We've got Stafford and then another just over on this side of the tent.
Thank you very much, Joe. Yeah, really, it's about slugs. We seem to be, as we go, less cultivations, more direct drilling. I know we're definitely finding more of a slug problem, and we've had cover crop situations where I'm sure the catch crop post oilseed rape prior to the wheat, we did something there, and we hardly had any slug pressure last autumn on crops, wheat crops after oilseed rape. We had lovely cover crops in the winter on really light land, and we managed to lose a field of vining peas to slugs grazing under the ground. So there's good news stories and bad news stories, and I don't really know how I'm falling into this trap, but it'd be great to hear some of your experiences. And the other question really for Jim is obviously cover crops are very expensive. What can we be doing on farm to try and reduce the cost by growing some of the base constituents and maybe adding to a King's mix on farm?
Well, if I just cover the slug bit quickly, we've certainly seen problems where things have gone wrong, but actually, in general, I think when we're in a bit of a system change with no-till, using the catch crops, cover crops, our carrot beetle populations are increasing, and that's going to help us out, but it doesn't necessarily stop it being a problem. Where I think we've benefited from drilling, say, catch crops this autumn, specifically anecdotally, there's a pass with the drill, the slug pellets out the back, and we followed up with the rolls. I think that's done a number on the slugs early on. We've then drilled again in the autumn, a small amount of slug pellets, rolls, and we haven't had to go back to those fields. Where we hadn't drilled the catch crop after winter beans, I had to chase around slug pellets like nothing else. And I don't know if that's simply anecdotal, it's heavy land, it was wet, but I think there might have been something in that. Come the spring, again, a termination timing, and it's always potentially going to be a problem if they've not got anything to eat.
Can I just give Tom, actually, I know Tom's had some specific challenges in this area, so before I go to Jim, Tom, slugs.
I thought you were going to present me with my award for the UK's best slug grower. But yeah, we have always had huge issues with slugs, even before we were cover cropping and direct drilling. But they haven't got any easier for a start. I kind of thought last year we might have turned a corner, to be perfectly honest. However, this year obviously is sort of put me back slightly.
There was just a bloody great big slug around the corner, was there?
Yeah, I tend to benchmark against. We have a local benchmarking group, and I gauge myself on the slug pellet spend. And last year I wasn't the top man, which I kind of thought must be we must have turned the corner slightly. And I do think there is something in what Toby said, especially with the catch cropping. I must admit, David Walson did a Nuffield scholarship a few years ago, and he broached that, and I thought it was a little bit rich, to be perfectly honest. But it does now seem to be that they will graze a cover crop and leave the emerging wheat plants alone for a start, which does seem to help. But I think the soil biology and understanding why we got soils is probably why we've got slugs even is probably one of the biggest things that we need to learn more about.
Jim?
I think these two have covered the slug issue off quite well. I think it's about cultivation for them. It's about good husbandry. It's about doing everything you possibly can to minimise that impact. They will be there, but weather and cultivation and husbandry will always be the biggest driver to have that slug population. In terms of cost, I'm not particularly going to get drawn into that one too much. Cover crop costs will vary from £25 a hectare to 60, depending on what you want to do. Nearly everybody is quite happy to provide straights for people to mix. The only thing I would say is that when you come to whoever's providing cover crops, we put a lot of time into making sure you've got the right number of seeds per square metre, that we work through with 1,000 grain weight, that everything we do is certified. We've actually turned away a brand new radish this year. It passed German certification, but not ours. When it got to our lab, we've sent it back. So we put a lot of time and effort into making sure it's right, but we're very happy to work with people who want to add their own constituents and buy the other stuff. You've got to be really good at making sure you mix it properly so that you do get then what you want out of it and the right seeds per square metre. So, happy medium to work with anybody on that one.
We do grow a few cover crop species for seed on our farm, accidentally for ourselves for a start, but then we now have a relationship with a local seed company where we grow vetch, mustard and buckwheat and occasionally Phacelia, but we don't want to talk about that quite so much. You need to make sure that you're well geared up, because a lot of these things are indeterminate. They'll be wet, they need drying, they need separating and cleaning on farm. So it's not something you can just jump straight into, and they aren't lucrative either. It's just a different crop, which is helpful.
No, thank you. Thanks, Tom. Toby, Jim, Tom, the Phacelia king of Suffolk. I think it's fair to say that 25 minutes is an insufficient amount of time to cover the issue of cover crops. But I presume we were only given this slot because there was concerns I was going to cock the whole thing up. So hopefully next year we can come back and have a slightly longer session of this. I'm sorry for those who still had questions to ask, but I've got to draw the session to a close. So if I could ask you just to show your appreciation for our three speakers. And thank you very much for coming.